God's people have been on a journey. Moses, in the name of God, has led them out of slavery in Egypt, and now they are in the wilderness, and they have hit an obstacle. They are hungry. Their stomachs are growling, and so their voices are shrill with fear. They know that if they are going to find bread, they're going to have to do it themselves, and the last place that they saw bread was in slavery in Egypt. And so they are saying, we just simply need to go back to Egypt. We've got to do it ourselves. We've got to get our own bread. And so let's head on back to the slavery that we once knew, but where our bellies were filled. It is a funny thing how anxiety can cause us to lose our memory. Because the reality of bread in Egypt was this. There was a great deal of pressure to produce. Getting bread was highly competitive, and so people would hoard what they had, and people were exploited in the name of getting bread. But the anxiety had caused them, the people of God, to lose their memory. Now, you and I, in the 21st century, don't go around wandering too much in what we'd call a wilderness, although in the 21st century, it is, as you've heard said, a jungle out there. We live in a world that is highly competitive. We know that in order to get what we need, we're going to have to do it ourselves. We are very self-reliant. There is pressure to produce. There is hoarding because we never know if we're going to have enough. And whether we realize it or not, people get exploited in this 21st century jungle. Now, fortunately for most of us, we aren't dealing with physical hunger on a daily basis. But we do hunger. We hunger for a place to belong. We hunger for meaning in our lives. We hunger to make a difference. And so it's worth noting that 4 times in our reading from Exodus, God says that God hears the cries of the people. 4 times. And twice God says, you shall see that I rescue. Twice. My New Testament professor used to say all the time, if it's repeated, it must be important. He had us trained. He would say, if it's repeated, and all us good little seminary students would say together, it must be important, and it is. God has a prescription for people who are highly anxious, highly self-reliant, highly convinced that they've got to take care of themselves, and people who have suffered memory loss. And the prescription is this: draw the people near, which literally in Hebrew is gather them to worship. Gather them to worship. And it is in worship that the people see not the glory of Egypt with all its wealth and extravagance and exploitation, but as the people gather to worship, people catch a glimpse of God's glory, God's light, God's presence, God's power, and God's promises. But this prescription, like every prescription, carries a responsibility for the one who is seeking to be healed. For the people in Exodus, and you and I today, are faced with a clear choice. The only way to decrease our anxiety is to make worship a priority. And the question is, will we do it? Tyler was teaching me this week about piano strings. Tyler said that with a new piano string, it is important that that string be tuned on a regular and frequent basis. Because as it is tuned, it is stretched so that it is at the proper pitch, but it quickly loosens up and needs to be stretched again. But in time and over time, as it is tuned on a regular basis, it begins to create a memory within that string. A memory of the pitch that it is tuned to. And as all the strings in a piano are tuned, they create a collective memory. Individual parts that together make harmony, make music. You see, that's what gathering together for worship does for you and for me. We are all basically new piano strings in the eyes of God. And so we gather together to worship and we get stretched. Our self-focus, our self-preoccupation gets set aside for an hour a week in order that we might become centered on God. And we are reminded that it is not that we are self-reliant, but that we as God's people are dependent on God for all that we have. It stretches us to recognize that God's grace is so incredibly abundant that even those folks that are new in our midst, even those folks that seem undeserving in our eyes, receive the same grace that we've received. It stretches us to recognize that even as God made sure that all people were fed on the Exodus journey, God cares about all people here and now, today. It stretches us to set aside our anxiety for a short amount of time to recognize that God does provide, and God provides enough for all. We are stretched like a piano string when we gather together to worship, and we go out the doors, and what happens? Well, during the week, we loosen up. And we start getting self-focused again. And we start telling ourselves that if anybody's going to get it done, we'll have to do it ourselves. And we start getting competitive, and our anxiety ratchets up. And we lose our memory, and so we need to return on a frequent, regular, weekly basis in order for God to tune us again. And as we come together collectively, we are all tuned to a perfect pitch, a collective memory. We are God's people, and we each play a part in God's incredible plan, play a part of harmony in the world and God's kingdom music for all to hear. You see, together we can overcome any obstacle. Together, we hold that memory of who God is and how God's at work in our lives, that Sabbath knowledge that God distributes bread in a way that cares for all, without competition and without anxiety. Together, we can overcome every obstacle.